Hello and welcome to this conversation here on ETV Bharat. I'm Smita Sharma, and today we are discussing the India-Iranian relationship, especially in the wake of certain reports that India may have been dropped as far as the Zahedan Chabahar, in fact, rail line project is concerned. Joining me on this conversation, Suhasini Haider, the Foreign Affairs Editor for The Hindu. In fact, she was the one who probed that news report, and we will be talking to Suhasini more about this. Also, Ambassador Casey Singh, a retired diplomat who's also served as India's ambassador to UAE and Iran. Appreciate you joining us, Ambassador Singh, as well on this conversation. So, Asif, to begin with you, just to put the matter out there for our audience. I mean, you wrote in your report that India has been dropped out, that Iran has now actually progressed as far as building that rail track project is concerned, which also connects to Zaranj in Afghanistan. We've seen some mixed reports, some officials from Iran being quoted in some news reports saying that the agreement wasn't signed in the first place with India, whereas we've just heard the Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson Anurag Srivastava react and say that the technical talks have been on and India is still waiting to hear from Iran since December of last year. What do you really sort of make sense of the comments that have now followed since your story?
Well, I think there's still a lot of confusion, certainly in New Delhi, because we have not really seen one single story coming out. And I should put in over here that the Hindu certainly contacted the Ministry of External Affairs as well as the embassy in Iran to try and get responses on the story, and there were none. The truth is that what has happened. On July 7th, we know for a fact that the Iranian minister inaugurated a railway line going from Chabahar to Zahedan. Iran has said on a number of occasions that it is going ahead with the project on its own finances, about $400 million that are coming from the Supreme Leader's National Development Fund. What is unclear is at what point India was either cut out of the deal or was told it's okay, you can join us later. So I think that confusion remains because from what we understand from the MEA statement is that they had put together a feasibility study, IRCON had, the company that was building it. They had held a meeting in the Joint Commission in December 2019. Since then, we know that the Foreign Minister of Iran came here, made an appeal that we should join this, we should help set up this railway as soon as possible. And then there's been sort of radio silence from what we understand of what the MEA is saying until now, when the railway project seems to have gone ahead. So I think a cogent response on the Indian side has yet to really come out about what happened. We know the Iranians have said a few things. You mentioned one particular statement by a port official saying that India never signed an agreement. That's technically correct because there was an MOU that was signed in 2016. We understand from MEA officials it was renewed in 2018, but since then we don't know where that MOU, what the position of the MOU is. It was never made into an agreement. So in that sense, there was no real agreement, but there's always been the expectation that India would be a part of this deal. So I think where we are right now is it seems very clear that Iran has started the railway construction. India is not a part of the railway construction project at present. Whether or not it joins at a different date. And I think some real searching questions have to be asked about why, if the MOU was signed in 2016, why is it that we are in this position in 2020?
Right. Suhasini raising all the pertinent points there. And before I also, in fact, focus on the larger strategic implications of what this means for the India-Iranian relationship, Ambassador Singh, what is your sense of what you're assessing from the reports at this point in time? I mean, if American sanctions are the possible fear that India has been slow in investing? Has that irked off the Iranians? There was a waiver which was provided in 2018 also, in particular for the Chabahar project. So what is really happening here? Is this a case of developing cold feet, or is there a case of some sort of a communication lap, a breakdown between the two countries which have shared historic relations?
Look, there are two things. One is domestic politics, which BJP doesn't like. Finger pointed to that, but the fact remains that after the abrogation of Article 370, the Iranians had taken a very forthright stand, including two tweets by the Supreme Leader, where he said, "So Muslims should be dealt with properly. This is not the way to deal with it." which we kind of whisked away and we said, there's just somebody saying something, it doesn't matter. All that matters. So for Iran, there is that. We have the second largest population of Shias. There are Shias in the Kashmir Valley. And therefore, the Iranians, with the supreme leader tweeting about it, India would have been ignoring it to India's own panel. But normally what happens is BJP thinks domestic politics is segregated from their international politics. They can do whatever they want at home, majoritarian politics, but international politics is secular. So we will do that. So that was a warning signal. Now, after that, what we learned from Bolton's book is that in June, July is when Abe went to Tehran. So the Iranians waited till about the middle of last year because this deal with China was on the table since 2016 when President Xi went to Iran. It wasn't that it's just come yesterday.
Right.
But that's where I think finally the Iranians realized that they can't do business with Trump. And for the supreme leader to issue a tweet before Abe boarded his flight, as Bolton recounts in his book, was as vicious as you can get on that. So they had made up their mind that you can't deal with Trump. And that was that. So now what happens? America is applying maximum pressure. India doesn't pay any attention to it. We had gone away from a traditional position of saying we will follow multilateral or UN sanctions, but we will not follow unilateral sanctions by US. Now you didn't want to offend this particular president. Then you go tangoing with him in September in Houston with the Howdy Modi. Then he comes right here doing his own thing in February in Ahmedabad. How do you expect the Iranians to read it? So there is a larger geopolitical shift. And that shift has now been exacerbated by the Chinese pushing across the LEC, pushing in Hong Kong, pushing in other places. You can see a convergence of forces between Russia, China, and Iran.
Right.
So the deal which has been leaked to the New York Times is a very clear deal that they've taken sides. They've gone with the Chinese because they have no option but to go with them because US is not giving them the least breathing space. They are not willing to even sit down at the table with any carrot. They're saying you first sit down at the table, concede what we want. That is Trump's idea of a deal. Now with that, they've gone into the Chinese corner. So essentially you're talking over 25. What China wants is energy. What China wants is a huge market of 70 million people. And China gets access of the entire northern coast of the Arabian Sea because they already had Gwadar. Then Chabahar was always iffy because remember, the Iranians a year or 2 years ago had even said, we're inviting the Chinese. Let the Chinese also come here. So it's a fiction that we have been selling to our own people, that we got Chabahar in a pocket. It's a strategic gain. It was no step.
In fact, it's a related question. It's a related question that I wanted to ask Ambassador Singh, because the Chinese deal that you're talking about, it's that deal that's being negotiated reportedly for 25 years, of $400 billion of strategic partnership that could very well cloud India's role in Iran and the region. But Chabahar, given the amount of fanfare that we saw on the trilateral connectivity projects during PM Modi's, in fact, visit, and then the entire focus, if this rail line really, India is sort of cut off, as Suhasini has reported, I mean, what are the larger implications for where India's future plans of connectivity to Central Asia, to Afghanistan, then stand in the region?
Look, it had been my view from the time I was there. I've maintained it continuously. This whole project has been oversold, overhyped. It's good if you get the connectivity. Why can't you get the connectivity from Bandar Abbas? If you calculate the distance from Bandar Abbas to Zaranj and Telaram, difference is probably 80 kilometers, 100 kilometers. Not that there is no Iranian port. The whole idea of Chabahar was that you get captive land there. You get area where you could have a free zone. The Iranians haven't given you that. They've given you a couple of berths for a limited period, which you can use. So, then we put a hype on it. We tend to get overexcited about these things. And particularly when prime ministerial visits are involved, we want to show it as a great win, as a great victory. And that is where reality then you leave reality behind. And you forget that you have to look at what Iranians are looking at. Not that the Chinese deal is a done deal. Because Iran, still has to go to their parliament. Somebody has leaked it to the New York Times. It's obviously gone from within the Iranian government. So the Iranians are great at negotiating. The Chinese will just discover, they'll keep negotiating. Now, really depend on strategic independence as one of their core things. From the time they became independent, the Islamic Revolution came. So therefore, for them to completely be in the Chinese corner, I don't think it would be an Iranian way of handling it. They will let in if you want at some stage. But I think they realize while Trump is there, they see you as completely under his thumb. And therefore, they don't see you as an independent actor.
Okay, so Hasani, taking forward what Ambassador Singh is flagging here, in your conversations, the off-record background conversations with Indian officials, what's the sense that you're getting? I mean, at the start of the Modi, government in 2014, 2015, we see this entire hype about a balancing of relations, about how India can have extremely good relations with both Iran and Israel, even with Saudi. You have this entire Chabahar being touted as a big project. And then suddenly this coldness. Are officials saying there's an extreme American pressure on New Delhi that they are, sort of responding to? It was there even in terms of the oil imports. Or is it something that India has now calculated that maybe the Iranian relation is something that they can afford for it to actually sort of, lie low for a bit?
Well, look, there is a history to what is happening. And to start with, I do want to make the point that what we are talking about right now is just the railway line. It is not the port. And I think we heard from the Ministry of External Affairs that the port is increasing its capacity, that it is viable now since December 2018. Some shipments have been going through, although I'm not sure, given the wording of the American sanctions waiver, what they can do beyond this kind of wheat transportation and basic aid for Afghanistan, whether they'll allow that to go through. When it comes to your question of how does the MEA see this, I honestly, I think there is a sense of helplessness, because a choice was made not about the railway line. A choice was made about Iran itself 2 years ago, when the US first put the sanctions back on oil imports from there, and then consistently sent the message that India must zero out its oil imports. Now, for a while, we thought this was absolutely impossible, because Iran was the third largest exporter of supplier of Indian oil. However, then we thought maybe there'll be other side deals that don't involve sanctioned authorities and entities that we will be able to buy oil from. Eventually, what we did was that we zeroed out, and I'm just going by what our ambassador in Washington said last year, that we have in fact completely cut our oil imports from Iran. So then the next step, if oil imports have been cut, are we going to accept all the other sanctions that the US has put on Iran? Because every day there's a new sanction, and Ambassador K.C. Singh quite rightly pointed out Bandar Abbas is a viable option, but even Bandar Abbas now is under heavy sanctions. So the question is, if we are accepting US sanctions, remember right at the beginning, former External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj said, we don't accept US sanctions, we only accept UN sanctions. That position has now been done away with. So if we are accepting US sanctions on oil, then, and we've received this waiver on Chabahar, which is a conditional waiver on it actually helping Afghanistan, the point has already been reached where we are, in a sense, diminishing our capabilities to deal with Iran. Then there are the oil reserves that we want to stake in. Then there are the other projects we would like to take part in. All of those have now fallen by the wayside. So I would see this railway line as a continuation of that attrition that has happened in India-Iran relations. And of course, as Ambassador Singh said, the political situation between India and Iran, particularly after Jammu and Kashmir and then the CAA, that is going to play a part over here, because we do know that Iran's hardliners do have a role. And then you have this sort of attrition taking place, and then you have the rise of the Chinese role as Iran loses its sources of income for oil supplies. And remember, the oil supplies to India mean that India cannot actually export other things to Iran. So right. India-Iran trade has actually just slumped. So we are looking at an attrition of this relationship at a time when China is getting more involved, and at a time when Iran is becoming more indebted to whoever will help them out. I think we are at an inflection point, and choices have to be made if they haven't already been made, is what I'm trying to say. Whether we have made that choice that we will take the US diktats on Iran, and whether Iran has decided that India is not going to be dependable given the US pressure, and therefore put their eggs in China's basket.
You know, which brings me to my last set of questions then, Ambassador Singh, taking forward what Suhasini just mentioned. You know, at a time when you're looking at the pending troop pullout from Afghanistan, of course, the US-Taliban peace, the deal, in fact, the agreement also happened post the killing of General Soleimani, you know, somebody who was visibly closer to New Delhi, who was opposed to the Pakistani establishment. At this point in time, can India really afford to sort of cede space? Can India really afford to go play on the, as far as the Iranian rule book is concerned, play on it only as far as the diktats of the US is concerned, you know, accept the US diktats on Iran instead of actually batting for its own historic relations with Iran?
That's what I told you in the beginning, which is what I said in my first remarks, that your domestic politics and your geopolitics have combined, and therefore you've taken a position. You're closer to Saudis and the Emiratis. Now, when you start taking sides in the Gulf, traditionally you could bridge the Gulf because you were seen as more or less even-handed, even though it changed under Manmohan Singh also. After the 2006 sanctions, UN sanctions, even Manmohan Singh scaled back. It's not that he defied, US and so on and so forth, but they kept a modicum of relationship, something going with Iran, because you didn't have your domestic politics going in that direction. And Iran was willing to cut you a leg because they have this interest in the Shia and the Islamic community in India, whether we like it or not. They see it as an unbroken larger ummah. Now, with Modi government, that's gone because, with all these various steps after re-election, very clearly they were moving on a majoritarian agenda, part of their majoritarian agenda till COVID stopped them. And therefore, the new friction point that came, combined with how Tehran will see it, your chumminess with the crown princes of Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia, your excessive friendliness with Trump, etc. All that in their mind would be seen as India having taken sides. Therefore,
what does India stand to lose? Ambassador Singh, sorry for interfering, but what does India stand to lose if the Modi government has actually made this decision that it will choose US over Iran?
Well, now you are therefore getting into camps, which is not what the traditional Indian policy is. So we should not pretend any longer that we can play all sides. You can't. You cited very clearly with camps which are closer to the US in the Gulf, and that will have consequences. Fine, if you made that choice, then those are the consequences, and the consequences will be that there is no such thing as a pure commercial economic deal with Iran. It's a revolutionary Islamic government. For them, everything is seen through the strategic window. Nothing is, commerce and trade is not a separate box. Everything is viewed, and that's why every MOU has a small print in it. If you can't read it, that is your problem. That's where South Bloc has lost their ability to read the small. The small print is that they will put it through the strategic, prism. And if they see the strategic rays are not aligning, then the commercial economic agreement has no meaning to it.
Right.
For them. It's when we start treating things in silos and boxes, and we think we can do Chabahar, but we can do what we want as far as the Muslims are concerned, as far as Americans are concerned, as far as the crown princes are concerned. Fine. That's not how Iran views it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm saying if you're going down that track, then don't be surprised if the Iranians assert themselves. And now that they have the Chinese support, they're acting independently, much more independently. It doesn't mean the doors are shut, but it means the doors are going to be more difficult to open. And you'll be now, what the Iranians are saying is, you played your cards, you positioned yourself, you didn't come to our rescue. When we are in trouble, the Chinese have come to your rescue. Your rescue. The Chinese are sitting on your, on top of your head in LSC. Don't go looking for support in Iran. I'm sure they'll be watching it very carefully.
Absolutely.
India needs it, so that's it. Now you deal with it.
Okay, so finally, Suhasini, of course, we've mentioned that there was 370, there were the Delhi riots, the CAA protests. In fact, even in the wake of COVID-19, we saw the speed with which New Delhi hurriedly shut down, in fact, flights from Tehran and then had to backpedal on it as well. relationships have clearly soured, barring the occasional, of course, statements put out there to try and project a certain bonhomie. Do you think there will be an attempt? Is there an attempt at course correction or some sort of a damage control here? Is there any reaction that you've got from the Afghans on this entire scenario so far, since they are also interlinked as far as the region is concerned?
No, I honestly, I don't think that the bonhomie was anything but real and genuine, because India and Iran have traditional ties that that are historical. I don't think that is in any doubt. As a result, and you mentioned what is the Afghan reaction. Remember that one of the big reasons Chabahar was positioned, and it may or may not actually be that, but it was positioned as a great geostrategic a sort of doorway for India, was that India would finally be able to move away from the problems of its meddlesome neighbor, Pakistan, that has consistently stopped or hindered trade between India and Afghanistan, India and Central Asia. For decades now, India has been like as if it has one arm chopped, that nothing to its Western neighbor can actually work. So therefore, Chabahar was going to be India's way of getting around this problem called Pakistan, going all the way to Afghanistan. And then, in fact, this particular railway line will go on to the Turkmenistan border. And then for Central Asia, Russia, if in fact the INSTC, or what is supposed to go through Bandar Abbas, the International North-South Transport Corridor, cannot be undertaken because of US sanctions, then this became another way to do it. And I think there is a third kind of damage, and that is reputational damage.
Right.
Whether or not we want to admit it, the two parts to this is, one is on strategic autonomy. Does India take its decisions based on one power in the world or not? Or whether India would say that, sorry, we only accept multilateral sanctions, UN sanctions, and would have gone ahead with this. And the second is the reputational damage, I'm sorry to say, on delivery, because the one thing everyone says to us is India has so much goodwill around the world. But your promises don't match up with the delivery then. And I come back to how I started, that even if we don't get into the big picture on this, we do need to understand why 4 years after the MOU was signed, it has not yet been made an agreement. And if we decided to drop the deal, or if Iran decided to drop us out of the deal, what exactly were the reasons for that?
Absolutely. And delivery of projects has remained, in fact, a constant complaint, in particular for immediate neighbors of India as well. Of course, the larger strategic implications of India staying in this project or not staying, and how does it move forward on the Iranian story, is something that will be watched very closely by the international community, India's own neighbors, Afghanistan, and the United States, of course. Appreciate Ambassador K.C. Singh and Suhasini Haider for joining me in this conversation. And if you tuned into this many times here in New Delhi, this is Smita Sharma for ETV Bharat.